The universe of Warhammer 40,000 is shaped by its larger-than-life characters, each an instrument of the Emperor's will, each embodying distinct ideals and methods in their pursuit of the Great Crusade. Among these figures, Corvus Corax stands apart as the epitome of stealth, freedom, and justice, a primarch whose very existence was defined by an unyielding drive to break the chains of oppression. Yet Corax was never alone in his mission. His allies and adversaries shaped his destiny, testing his resolve and pushing him into ever darker corners of the galaxy's endless conflict. As Primarch of the Raven Guard, Corax commanded a legion molded in his own shadowy image. They were warriors who thrived in darkness, masters of covert operations and guerrilla tactics. This unique identity set them apart from the other Space Marine legions, whose strategies favored open combat and grand displays of power. The Raven Guard specialized in silent strikes, ambushes, and acts of sabotage, preferring precision over brute force. This approach to warfare made them invaluable allies, but also difficult to understand for their more overtly aggressive counterparts. The Raven Guard's loyalty to Corax was absolute, forged in the fires of battles that prioritized the liberation of oppressed populations. Many within the Legion came from deliverance and were inspired by the same desire for justice that had driven Corax in his youth. They admired him not just as their leader, but as a savior who had freed them from tyranny. To his Legion, Corax was more than a primarch. He was the spirit of deliverance incarnate, a champion of the downtrodden who fought for the weak and punished the unjust. His Legion followed him with a fanatical loyalty, willing to embrace his ideals of self-sacrifice and quiet resilience. Beyond his Legion, Corax found an unlikely ally in Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's trusted advisor, and perhaps the only human who understood the nuances of Corax's philosophy. Malcador was a man who worked in the shadows, wielding influence and knowledge to shape the galaxy according to the Emperor's design. He appreciated Corax's aversion to needless bloodshed and saw him as a necessary counterbalance to the more brutal approaches of certain other primarchs. Though their interactions were limited, Malcador provided Corax with insights and resources to carry out his operations. Through Malcador, Corax was granted access to forbidden knowledge and rare artifacts, tools that would become vital in his quest to rebuild the Raven Guard after the devastation of Istvan V. Not all relationships were so harmonious, however. Among Corax's most significant adversaries was Lorgar, Primarch of the Word Bearers. Lorgar's religious fanaticism and obsession with spreading his twisted version of the Emperor's truth stood in direct opposition to Corax's ideals of freedom and rationality. Where Corax believed in fighting for the oppressed, Lorgar sought to impose his will, claiming that the galaxy needed the Emperor's light as a dogma rather than a guiding principle. This clash of philosophies turned Lorgar into a bitter rival, and their enmity would reach its peak during the Horus Heresy, when Lorgar's fanaticism led him to embrace chaos, corrupting his legion and setting them against the Imperium. For Corax, Lorgar's betrayal was a personal affront, a defilement of everything he held sacred. Perhaps more troubling than his rivalry with Lorgar was the tense relationship between Corax and Robut Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines. Guilliman, a master of strategy and order, saw the galaxy as a vast, interlocking system of rules and hierarchies, and he pursued stability above all. In contrast, Corax valued flexibility and freedom, distrusting overly rigid structures that he believed led to oppression. Guilliman's emphasis on the Codex Astartes, a set of rules for organizing the Space Marine legions, conflicted with Corax's belief that war was too chaotic to fit within strict parameters. While they shared a mutual respect, their differing perspectives created a silent tension. Guilliman's methods struck Corax as overly bureaucratic, reducing the individual warrior to a cog in an immense, impersonal machine. To Corax, true victory lay in freeing humanity, not merely in enforcing order. Beyond these personal relationships, the broader dynamics among the primarchs influenced Corax's journey. Horus, once a trusted brother and the war master of the Emperor's armies, would become the greatest betrayer. Horus's descent into heresy tore the galaxy apart and forced Corax to confront the ultimate betrayal, a primarch turning against the Emperor. For Corax, this treachery was a wound that cut deeper than any physical injury. The betrayal at Istvan V, where Horus orchestrated the massacre of loyalist forces, left the Raven Guard crippled and shattered Corax's faith in the bonds of brotherhood that had once united the primarchs. This act of treachery marked the beginning of a new, harsher reality for Corax, one in which he was forced to rely on his own judgment, trust few, and take extreme measures to preserve what little remained of his legion. In the wider Imperium, Corax's methods and ideals also found mixed support. High-ranking Imperial officials, accustomed to a culture of strict control, often saw Corax's insistence on autonomy and resistance to oppression as borderline subversive. They appreciated the efficiency of his tactics, but remained wary of his reluctance to follow rigid chains of command. Some within the Imperium's upper echelons viewed him as a necessary tool in desperate times, but feared that his philosophy could lead to rebellion if it spread. His reputation as a liberator earned him the respect of many ordinary citizens, but it also sowed seeds of mistrust among those who valued order over liberty. Amidst these alliances and rivalries, Corax found rare kinship with Jagatai Khan, Primarch of the White Scars. Khan shared Corax's affinity for unconventional tactics and disdain for authoritarianism, and both Primarchs recognized the importance of maintaining their individuality in the face of the Imperium's vast machinery. Their legions, though different in style, both embraced the fluidity of warfare and avoided unnecessary cruelty. In Jagatai, Corax found a kindred spirit, a fellow warrior who respected the need for personal freedom, even in a galaxy ruled by an iron-fisted Imperium. In sum, Corax's journey was profoundly shaped by the complex web of relationships he maintained with his allies, rivals, and his own legion. Each connection added new dimensions to his character, challenging his beliefs and forcing him to adapt in an ever-changing galaxy. His alliances with figures like Malkador and Jagatai helped him forge a path forward, while his rivalries with Lorgar and Guilliman exposed the cracks in his worldview. The Raven Lord's story, like the shadowed wings of his legion, moved in the spaces between light and dark, forging alliances of necessity and facing adversaries of principle. As the galaxy plunged deeper into chaos, these connections would prove crucial, shaping Corax's decisions and setting the stage for the trials that lay ahead. Corvus Corax's story is a testament to resilience forged under oppression, marked by a life of rebellion, sacrifice, and unyielding dedication to justice. Before Corax would become the enigmatic figure of the Raven Lord, he was a lone fighter on the prison planet Lycaeus, where his legacy as a liberator and tactician was born amidst the darkest of circumstances. This origin would instill in him not only the foundation of his values, but also the beginnings of the tactics and strategies that would define him. Corax's early years were spent in the harsh industrial wastelands of Lycaeus, a prison moon orbiting the planet Kiavar. Known for its mines and the brutal treatment of its laborers, Lycaeus was ruled with an iron fist by the guilds and corporations of Kiavar, who treated its inhabitants as nothing more than tools. These overseers were merciless, sending patrols to ensure the absolute submission of their workers. Life on Lycaeus was a constant struggle, where any thought of freedom or rebellion was crushed beneath the weight of the overseer's tyrannical rule. But Corax was no ordinary inhabitant. Even in his youth, he harbored a deep-seated hatred of tyranny. His strength and intellect set him apart from the other prisoners, marking him as a natural leader. It wasn't long before whispers of his defiance spread among the laborers. At first, it was simply talk, a hint of rebellion, an unspoken hope that Corax might one day lead them out of bondage. Yet as the brutality of the overseers intensified, these whispers grew louder, transforming into a movement fueled by Corax's quiet but resolute defiance. Recognizing that open rebellion would be suicidal, Corax began his campaign of resistance by waging a war in the shadows. Under his guidance, the prisoners started to sabotage the mining operations, crippling the productivity that sustained the corporations on Kiavar. The overseers scrambled to maintain order, but Corax's growing network of allies allowed him to outmaneuver them at every turn. He became a phantom, a figure the overseers could not catch, striking from the darkness and disappearing before they could retaliate. His tactics quickly earned him respect and loyalty from the miners, and his legend grew with each act of defiance. As Corax's influence spread, he began to shift from isolated strikes to a coordinated uprising. He taught his followers the tactics of guerrilla warfare, instructing them in the use of sabotage, ambushes, and misdirection. These tactics became the backbone of his rebellion, a style of combat that relied not on brute strength, but on agility, patience, and precision. Corax emphasized the importance of stealth and surprise, exploiting the weaknesses of the overseers' rigid structure and their reliance on brute force. For the first time, the people of Lycius dared to dream of freedom. Under Corax's leadership, the rebellion grew into a well-organized force. Secret gatherings turned into formal assemblies, where Corax and his most trusted advisors planned their next moves. His strategies were revolutionary for Lycius, where no organized resistance had ever managed to survive. Corax instilled in his people a sense of purpose, an understanding that their struggle was not just for survival, but for liberation, a liberation they could achieve only if they were willing to fight in a new way. But Corax knew that simply weakening the overseers was not enough. They needed a decisive blow to break their chains permanently. For months, he gathered intelligence on the overseers' operations, carefully analyzing their patrol schedules, supply routes, and communication networks. He discovered that the overseers were heavily dependent on regular shipments from Kiavar to maintain their grip on Lycius. These supply lines became the target of Corax's most daring plan yet, a coordinated assault that would sever the overseers' lifeline and cripple their ability to control the prison population. In the dead of night, Corax and his rebels launched their attack. They struck with brutal efficiency, intercepting supply convoys, destroying critical infrastructure, and eliminating key overseers in a series of swift, targeted strikes. The overseers, caught off guard and unable to call for reinforcements, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity and precision of the rebellion. Panic spread through the ranks of the overseers as they realized that their authority was slipping away. As the fighting intensified, Corax's reputation among the miners transformed him into a near-mythic figure, a hero of the shadows who struck fear into the hearts of their oppressors. The people of Lycius rallied around him, drawn by his unwavering dedication and his ability to inspire even in the face of overwhelming odds. His leadership gave them hope, a vision of a future where they could be free. And as their confidence grew, so did their resolve to see the rebellion through to its end. The final confrontation came swiftly. With their resources depleted and their morale shattered, the overseers could no longer maintain control. Corax led his people in a decisive assault on the overseers' command center, where the last remnants of their authority were concentrated. The battle was fierce, but Corax's forces were relentless, driven by the promise of freedom and the desire to rid themselves of their tormentors once and for all. When the dust settled, the overseers had been defeated, their grip on Lycius broken. With victory secured, Corax did not take on the role of a conqueror. Instead, he dismantled the overseers' regime, freeing the miners and establishing a new order based on justice and equality. In the wake of the rebellion, Lycius was no longer a prison. It had been reborn as deliverance, a symbol of hope, a testament to the strength of those who refused to be subjugated. Yet Corax's journey was far from over. The rebellion on Lycius caught the attention of the Emperor himself, who had been watching from afar. Drawn by Corax's strength, resourcefulness, and dedication to justice, the Emperor descended upon Deliverance. There, in the aftermath of revolution, he revealed himself to Corax, offering him a place in the Great Crusade, a chance to take his fight for freedom to the stars. Corax accepted, not out of a desire for power, but because he saw in the Emperor's vision an opportunity to extend his ideals beyond Deliverance. He would take his place among the Emperor's chosen, leading his own legion, the Raven Guard, into the galactic fray. But as Corax looked back upon the world he had freed, he understood that his battle had only begun. The struggle for freedom, for justice, was an endless one, and he would carry its burden with him wherever he went. Upon joining the Emperor's Great Crusade, Corvus Corax was granted command of his own Space Marine Legion, the Raven Guard. They were an already established force of genetically enhanced warriors who had served the Emperor loyally, yet they lacked the guiding purpose and focused vision that Corax brought to them. His arrival redefined the Legion's identity, transforming them into an elite force known for their ability to strike unseen and vanish without a trace. Under Corax's command, the Raven Guard became more than just soldiers. They became symbols of liberation and justice, warriors of the shadows who fought for those who could not defend themselves. Corax wasted no time instilling his tactical philosophy into the Legion. Where other legions embraced overwhelming force and brutal displays of power, Corax believed in the importance of precision and minimal collateral damage. The Raven Guard became experts in stealth, reconnaissance, and guerrilla warfare, preferring ambushes, feints, and sabotage over direct confrontation. They would dismantle enemy forces from within, destabilizing key positions and sowing confusion before delivering a fatal strike. Every engagement was meticulously planned to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, a trait that distinguished them from many other Space Marine legions. As the Raven Guard adapted to Corax's methods, they undertook campaigns that other legions could not. Corax often led them into missions that required utmost discretion, targeting enemy leaders, severing supply lines, or crippling infrastructure without ever being seen. The Raven Guard quickly earned a reputation as the Emperor's silent blades, feared by their enemies for their lethal efficiency and ability to vanish before a counterattack could be mounted. To those who suffered under oppressive regimes, however, they were heroes, a force of retribution against tyrants and conquerors. One of the earliest campaigns that demonstrated Corax's impact on the Raven Guard took place on the planet Kiavar, which bordered his home world of Deliverance. Kiavar had fallen into rebellion against the Imperium, led by factions that sought to reassert the old order of exploitation that once ruled Lycius. The Emperor, recognizing Corax's personal stake in the matter, tasked the Raven Guard with suppressing the uprising and bringing the planet back into compliance. It was a delicate mission, as Kiavar's population was already bitter and distrustful, scarred by centuries of corporate oppression. Instead of launching a full-scale assault, Corax chose a more restrained approach. Rather than treating the rebels as enemies, he sent Raven Guard operatives to infiltrate the rebellious factions, identifying their leaders and discerning their motivations. Corax understood that many of the rebels were not acting out of loyalty to their old oppressors, but out of a desire for autonomy and fear of the Imperium's rule. With precise strikes, he removed the most ruthless leaders of the rebellion while sparing those who showed potential for change. This strategy not only neutralized the threat, but also transformed the perception of the Imperium among Kiavar's citizens. They came to see the Raven Guard as protectors rather than conquerors, a rare sentiment in a galaxy ruled by fear and force. With each mission, Corax's influence over the Raven Guard deepened. His methods attracted recruits who shared his values, creating a unique culture within the Legion. The Raven Guard were disciplined yet empathetic, soldiers who held themselves to a moral code even in the midst of war. This approach fostered a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival or conquest. The Legion fought not only for the Imperium, but also to protect those who could not protect themselves. Corax encouraged his warriors to remember their roots, to view themselves as liberators and defenders rather than enforcers of the Emperor's will. But Corax's approach was not without its critics. Among the other primarchs, there were those who questioned his methods and viewed his emphasis on stealth and restraint as weaknesses. Leman Russ, primarch of the Space Wolves, believed in the power of direct action and often clashed with Corax over tactics, dismissing his methods as overly cautious. To Russ, war was a test of strength and resolve, and he saw no merit in tactics that avoided confrontation. Corax, however, remained resolute. He had seen firsthand the cost of unnecessary violence and was determined not to repeat the mistakes of others who sacrificed lives needlessly for the sake of pride or tradition. Despite the skepticism of some of his brothers, the Raven Guard's unique capabilities proved invaluable as the Great Crusade continued. They were deployed in numerous engagements that required precision and discretion, from quelling insurrections to assassinating enemy leaders and dismantling dangerous cults before they could grow into larger threats. Their contributions were often unsung, for Corax and his legion worked in the shadows, preferring not to draw attention to their achievements. This discretion, however, only added to the Raven Guard's mystique, and stories of their deeds spread throughout the Imperium, turning Corax into a figure both respected and feared. However, the moral clarity that Corax had sought to bring to his legion would soon be tested. As the crusade expanded, the Imperium encountered worlds and cultures vastly different from anything Corax or his warriors had seen. The Emperor's directive was clear: compliance at any cost. Yet Corax often found himself questioning the wisdom of this approach. On numerous occasions, he faced societies that, while primitive by imperial standards, were peaceful and self-sufficient. In his eyes, enforcing compliance on such worlds felt more like conquest than liberation. The tension between his loyalty to the Emperor and his own ethical convictions became a constant struggle, a conflict that Corax could not easily reconcile. One notable mission brought the Raven Guard to a world known as Corvus, where the population had developed a unique culture rooted in harmony with their environment. They resisted imperial compliance, fearing that their way of life would be destroyed. Corax, sensing the people's genuine fear, attempted to negotiate with the local leaders, seeking a solution that would allow them to join the Imperium without abandoning their traditions. But the Imperium's demand for full compliance left no room for compromise. In the end, Corax was forced to order a strike against Corvus's leaders, a decision that haunted him. Though the mission was a success by the Imperium's standards, Corax could not shake the feeling that he had betrayed his own ideals. This internal conflict began to weigh heavily on Corax. He had once believed that the Great Crusade was a mission of unity, a campaign to bring peace and order to humanity. Yet as he encountered more worlds like Corvus, he saw that the Imperium's vision was often one of homogenization, where diversity was suppressed in favor of absolute control. Corax, who had spent his life fighting for freedom, found himself increasingly at odds with the Imperium's authoritarianism. The contradictions within the Imperium's mission became a source of disillusionment, yet he continued to serve out of loyalty to the Emperor and a hope that one day things might change. As these doubts festered, Corax's relationship with his brothers became strained. He found kindred spirits in Jagatai Khan and Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamanders, who shared his respect for life and his disdain for unnecessary brutality. But other Primarchs, especially those who saw the Crusade as a test of strength, viewed Corax's doubts as a weakness. To them, his compassion and reluctance to impose compliance by force were signs that he lacked the ruthlessness necessary to shape the galaxy. Corax, however, held fast to his convictions, determined to balance his duty with his principles, even as it isolated him from his brothers. As the Raven Guard continued their campaigns, Corax's desire to protect the weak and uphold justice remained his guiding star. But he knew that a storm was brewing, that the contradictions within the Imperium and his own heart could not remain unresolved forever. The dark times ahead would challenge not only his beliefs, but also the very foundations of his loyalty. For Corax, the Great Crusade was no longer simply a mission of conquest. It had become a battle for his own soul, a fight to stay true to the ideals that had defined him since his days on Lycius. As the Great Crusade progressed, tensions within the Imperium continued to escalate, setting the stage for the Horus Heresy, a cataclysmic civil war that would tear the galaxy apart. For Corvus Corax and the Raven Guard, the betrayal of Horus and the descent into chaos marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters of their existence. This brutal period would test the very core of Corax's principles and drive him to make decisions that would forever haunt him. The heresy began as whispers in the dark, a subtle shift in the attitudes and loyalties of certain primarchs. Yet, as alliances shifted and mistrust grew, Corax and his legion remained focused on their missions, unaware of the treachery spreading within the ranks of the Emperor's sons. The Raven Guard were deployed on the far reaches of the Imperium, tasked with securing volatile sectors that required their expertise in stealth and subversion. These missions isolated them from the unfolding conspiracy, keeping them in the dark about Horus's growing influence over some of the legions. But Corax was perceptive, and he began to notice strange occurrences, orders that seemed inconsistent with the Emperor's vision, reports of brutal actions taken by once loyal legions, and a sense of unease that permeated his conversations with certain primarchs. Suspicion crept into his mind, but the Raven Lord held fast to his loyalty, trusting in the strength of the Emperor's design. To him, the Great Crusade, despite its flaws, was still a force for unity, a mission worth any sacrifice. Even so, he kept his legion close, training them relentlessly and preparing for whatever might come. Then the call came from Horus himself. The Raven Guard, alongside other legions, was summoned to the system of Istvan, where Horus claimed that loyalist forces needed reinforcements to quash an uprising against the Imperium. Corax had no reason to doubt the War Master's word, for Horus had always been respected as a skilled leader, an exemplar of the Emperor's ideals. He marshaled his forces, leading the Raven Guard into the heart of what would soon be revealed as a trap that would nearly annihilate his legion. Upon reaching Istvan Faith, Corax and his legion descended to the planet's surface alongside the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and other loyalist forces. The plan was to confront the so-called traitor forces head-on and bring an end to the rebellion swiftly. But as they moved deeper into the combat zone, Corax realized too late the extent of the deception. The Loyalists were outnumbered, surrounded by legions that had pledged their allegiance not to the Emperor, but to Horus. The world of Istvan Fifth would forever be remembered as a site of treachery, a place where brother turned against brother, and loyalty was shattered by betrayal. When the traitor legions struck, the slaughter was brutal and swift. Caught off guard, the Loyalist forces were decimated in a matter of hours. Corax watched as his brothers fell, and the Raven Guard, known for their precision and coordination, were thrown into chaos. The traitors' assault was unrelenting, and even the Raven Guard's expertise in guerrilla tactics offered little advantage against the overwhelming numbers and firepower of their former allies. Desperation set in as Corax attempted to rally his forces, directing them to fall back and regroup. His orders were clear: survive, escape, and return to the Emperor. The Raven Guard fought with grim determination, using every ounce of their training to evade the traitors' onslaught. Corax personally led his warriors in rearguard actions, buying time for as many of his legion as possible to retreat. His mind raced with questions, unable to fully comprehend the scope of Horus's treachery, yet fully aware that survival was now their only hope of vengeance. As night fell on Istvan Fifth, the once green landscape was scorched and littered with the bodies of fallen astartes. Only a fraction of the Raven Guard managed to escape the massacre, their ranks devastated and their spirit broken. Corax himself was gravely wounded but alive, driven by a grim resolve to return to Terra and warn the Emperor of the horrors he had witnessed. The retreat was a bitter victory, For Corax understood that his legion was but a shadow of its former strength, and their path to redemption would be a long and harrowing one. Back on Terra, Corax was consumed by grief and rage. The loss of his legion and the betrayal of Horus had wounded him deeply, yet his determination remained unbroken. He sought an audience with the Emperor, pleading for the means to rebuild his shattered legion and avenge those who had fallen. The Emperor, understanding the depth of Corax's suffering, granted him access to a forbidden repository of genetic knowledge. Armed with these dark secrets, Corax vowed to restore the Raven Guard to their former glory, no matter the cost. Driven by desperation, Corax began the process of rapidly cloning new Raven Guard warriors. He immersed himself in the study of genetic engineering, pushing the boundaries of what was considered safe or ethical. The newly produced Space Marines, however, were far from perfect. Many of them emerged as twisted, malformed versions of what Corax had envisioned. The cloning process was flawed, resulting in monstrous creations that bore little resemblance to the disciplined warriors of the original Raven Guard. Corax's desire to restore his legion had inadvertently unleashed horrors upon his own forces. Haunted by the sight of his own failures, Corax took it upon himself to end the lives of these genetic aberrations. With each purge, the weight of his decisions bore down on him, filling him with a profound sense of guilt and regret. He had sought to bring his warriors back from the brink, to regain the strength needed to strike back at Horus and his traitor legions, but his actions had only deepened his torment. The Raven Lord, once a symbol of justice and liberation, now stood as a broken man, burdened by the consequences of his ambition. In the depths of his despair, Corax continued his quest to perfect the cloning process, convinced that he could still salvage his vision. The Raven Guard, those who remained loyal and whole, looked on as their primarch grew more withdrawn, consumed by his need for redemption. They too carried the scars of Istvan V, yet they continued to serve with unwavering loyalty, honoring the ideals Corax had instilled in them from the beginning. Ultimately, the experiment proved too costly, and Corax was forced to confront the reality of his actions. The shattered remnants of his legion, weakened but resilient, would have to find strength in their own resolve rather than in cloned reinforcements. Corax ordered an end to the cloning process, acknowledging the dangers of tampering with forbidden knowledge. The Raven Guard would remain fewer in number, but those who survived would carry forward his ideals with undiminished loyalty. Yet Corax's trials were not over. The Horus heresy continued to spread, threatening the very fabric of the Imperium. Even as he struggled to rebuild, Corax knew that he could not rest while the traitors remained unpunished. With a hardened resolve, he led the Raven Guard back into the shadows, waging a relentless campaign against the forces of Horus wherever he could. Though they were fewer in number, the survivors of Istvan fought with a ferocity unmatched, determined to honor the memory of their fallen brothers. The Raven Guard became a scourge upon the traitors, striking without warning and disappearing before the enemy could retaliate. Corax's tactics evolved, becoming even more brutal and unyielding. Every engagement was a reminder of Istvan, a chance to reclaim a sliver of the honor that had been stolen from them. Yet, despite his outward ferocity, Corax could not shake the guilt and regret that weighed upon him. The shadows that had once been his allies now haunted him, a constant reminder of the sacrifices he had made and those he had lost. In time, the weight of these losses would drive Corax to the brink of despair, leading him down a path from which few primarchs could return. His journey, once driven by hope and ideals, had become a relentless pursuit of vengeance. But even in his darkest moments, Corax clung to the memory of deliverance and the ideals that had once defined him. For the Raven Lord, there was no turning back. His path was set, and he would see it through to the bitter end, whatever the cost. As the chaos of the Horus heresy engulfed the galaxy, Corax continued his unyielding struggle against the forces of betrayal. Yet the Raven Guard, diminished and still bearing the scars of their decimation, faced a bitter reality. They were at the limits of their endurance, with resources depleted and numbers dwindling. Every engagement took a toll, and each loss was irreplaceable. For Corax, each fallen warrior was a stark reminder of his legion's vulnerability and the unending weight of their sacrifices. The very ideals he had long cherished, freedom, justice, and the preservation of life, were increasingly overshadowed by a relentless drive for vengeance against those who had torn his legion asunder. With time, Corax's tactics evolved further. He adapted to the Raven Guard's weakened state, relying on strategies that emphasized psychological warfare and precision strikes rather than prolonged engagements. The Raven Guard became specters of vengeance, launching rapid surgical strikes on isolated traitor forces, demoralizing the enemy by erasing critical targets with ruthless efficiency. This was not war as his brothers practiced it, but a calculated campaign of terror, one that forced traitor forces to constantly look over their shoulders, fearing the next strike. They became hunted, a psychological torment that wore down even the most battle-hardened of the traitors. For the Raven Guard, each skirmish, each ambush was an act of retribution, a testament to their resilience against insurmountable odds. Despite the growing reputation of the Raven Guard's renewed terror tactics, Corax's interactions with other loyalist forces were strained. Many commanders saw the Raven Guard as a legion on the edge, and their new methods were viewed with unease. Even among his allies, Corax noticed distrust in their eyes, a silent apprehension about the lengths to which he and his warriors were now willing to go. Once admired as liberators, the Raven Guard had transformed into avenging phantoms, feared by enemies and allies alike. In this grim chapter, Corax found himself isolated, not only from the Imperium he had once fought to protect, but also from his own past ideals. The betrayal at Istvan had left a scar too deep to heal. The loss of his legion's unity, the failure of his experiments to rebuild their strength, and the unforgiving pressures of constant war had reshaped him. The drive to uphold justice and protect the innocent had been replaced by an obsession to see the traitors pay for their actions. To Corax, the very essence of honor had changed. No longer was it enough to simply uphold ideals. He had to ensure that the traitors faced retribution no matter the cost. One of the most striking shifts in Corax's approach was his decision to target not just traitor combatants, but also the logistical networks and support systems that allowed the traitor legions to thrive. He led his warriors in covert strikes that disrupted supply chains, severed communications, and dismantled networks of influence that connected Horus's forces. In one of his most daring campaigns, Corax and a small elite detachment of Raven Guard infiltrated a traitor-held manufacturum world, crippling their ability to produce and distribute ammunition and supplies. The operation, executed with chilling precision, left the planet in chaos, with vital resources destroyed and local morale shattered. By striking at the infrastructure rather than the armies directly, Corax deprived the traitor legions of the lifeblood they needed to sustain their war effort. These calculated strikes allowed the Raven Guard to avoid direct confrontations, minimizing their own losses while maximizing the damage to the enemy. Yet, as these attacks continued, Corax's inner conflict grew. He knew that his tactics were effective, yet they diverged from the principles he had once held dear. Every covert operation and every act of destruction felt like a betrayal of the values he had instilled in his legion. To Corax, this paradox became increasingly suffocating, trapping him between his commitment to victory and his fading sense of honor. Amidst these ongoing campaigns, Corax encountered the first inklings of a new threat, the dark powers that had corrupted some of his own brothers. The forces of chaos, as they were known to the Imperium, seeped into every aspect of the war, spreading fear and corruption. While he had known of the existence of these malign forces in a limited sense, the full realization of their influence struck him during a campaign against Wordbearer's forces on a barren, blighted planet. As the Raven Guard closed in on their target, Corax witnessed the horrifying transformation of enemy soldiers into creatures warped by the powers of the warp itself, creatures that defied reason and represented a level of malice he had never encountered. In that moment, Corax recognized the gravity of the threat that chaos posed not only to the Imperium, but to the very fabric of humanity. It was a force that preyed upon the weaknesses of the soul, manipulating and corrupting without remorse. This understanding forced Corax to confront a chilling realization. The war was no longer solely a battle of ideologies or rivalries among the primarchs. It had become a struggle for the survival of humanity itself against a darkness that sought to consume it. The Raven Lord, who had once fought for liberation and justice, now faced an enemy that sought nothing less than the total annihilation of all he held sacred. With a renewed sense of purpose, Corax and his legion adapted their tactics once more, incorporating methods to counter the corrupting influence of chaos. The Raven Guard became adept at identifying signs of taint and swiftly eliminating corrupted forces before they could spread their influence. In this new war, there was no room for mercy. The Raven Guard's strikes became more ruthless and methodical as Corax enforced a zero-tolerance policy against any hint of chaos corruption. This led him to issue a directive to his legion. Every engagement with the forces of chaos was to be treated as a purge, a cleansing operation where no survivor would be left to spread the corruption further. As Corax delved deeper into the mysteries of chaos, he sought knowledge and guidance from allies who had encountered similar threats. He forged a cautious alliance with the Sisters of Silence, the enigmatic anti-psyker warriors who shared his dedication to eradicating the influence of the warp. Through them, Corax learned techniques to shield his warriors from the corruptive power of chaos, and his forces became increasingly vigilant in their resistance to the dark allure of the warp. Yet even with these precautions, the presence of chaos was a constant threat, always lurking at the edges of his awareness, a reminder of the darkness that had claimed so many of his brothers. Over time, the toll of this constant vigilance wore heavily on the Raven Guard. Corax's strict adherence to purging any sign of chaos corruption led to a growing isolation within the Legion. His warriors became increasingly distrustful of outsiders, and even among themselves, there was a wariness that was born of fear. The bonds of brotherhood that had once united them were strained by the weight of this unending vigilance, yet they endured, for they knew that they were fighting not only for the Imperium, but for the very soul of humanity. In his darkest moments, Corax would retreat to the shadows, grappling with the toll that the heresy had taken on him and his legion. He had once believed in the strength of ideals and the power of liberation, but now he found himself bound by a war that left little room for mercy or hope. The fight against chaos was relentless, consuming, and it left him questioning if there was any future for the Imperium beyond endless struggle. But even as these doubts gnawed at him, Corax remained unyielding, driven by the need to see his legion endure, to see humanity protected from the darkness that threatened to engulf it. For the Raven Lord, there was no return to the life he had once envisioned. The shadows had become his home, a place where he and his warriors could continue their silent vigil, watching over the Imperium from afar. They were no longer liberators or heroes in the traditional sense. The Raven Guard had become the guardians of humanity's soul, willing to do what was necessary, even if it meant surrendering their own light to keep the darkness at bay. And though the galaxy knew them only as silent avengers, Corax and his legion remained steadfast, determined to see their fight through to the end, no matter the cost. In the heart of the heresy's darkest days, as the forces of chaos spread corruption across the galaxy, Corax found himself walking an increasingly perilous path. The Raven Guard's battles had evolved into a relentless series of calculated, brutal operations that demanded every ounce of his tactical acumen. Yet Corax knew that his once mighty legion had become a small, haunted remnant of its former self. Every mission was a reminder of what they had lost, a shadow of the glorious force he had once commanded. But in these dire circumstances, necessity drove him to explore even more drastic measures, ones that would bring him closer to the very darkness he sought to destroy. To combat the swelling tide of traitors and corrupted forces, Corax turned to one of the Imperium's greatest secrets, ancient and forbidden technologies held within the vaults of Deliverance. These hidden repositories contained weapons and relics from before the age of the Emperor, powerful, unpredictable tools that had been sealed away due to the risk they posed. Corax, ever the strategist, saw their potential. If wielded correctly, these forbidden technologies could be devastating weapons against Horus's forces, tools to tip the balance in the Raven Guard's favor. One of these weapons was a device capable of creating fields of darkness so dense that not even the enhanced senses of an astartes could penetrate it. Known as the Umbra Veil Asterisk, this ancient technology could cloak entire squads, allowing the Raven Guard to operate undetected even in close proximity to their enemies. Yet, for all its power, the device was unstable, prone to sporadic failures and dangerous backfires. Nonetheless, Corax saw in it a crucial asset, one that would allow his warriors to turn the tide in key confrontations. He authorized the device's limited use, and the Raven Guard's most elite squads were equipped with the Umbra Veil, transforming them into true phantoms of the battlefield, unseen and unstoppable. Another forbidden technology Corax unearthed was the Eclipse Drive Asterisk, a prototype stealth engine designed to render entire ships invisible to conventional sensors. It allowed the Raven Guard to deploy forces deep into traitor-held territory undetected, enabling them to strike in areas thought safe from Imperial forces. The Eclipse Drive, however, carried with it the potential for catastrophic malfunction. Its mechanisms were barely understood even by the most advanced tech priests. Still, Corax saw no other choice. He ordered its integration into the Raven Guard's fleet, pushing the Legion further into the shadows and allowing them to carry out some of their most daring operations yet. They became more than warriors. They were hunters, drifting undetected through the void, bringing terror to the traitors wherever they ventured. These relics of a bygone age were powerful but temperamental, a constant reminder of the delicate line Corax walked between innovation and recklessness. Every use of the Umbra Veil or the Eclipse Drive reminded him that he was playing with forces beyond his control. And yet, for Corax, these technologies were a necessary evil, an edge that allowed his Legion to strike where others could not. Each mission carried the risk of failure or worse, but the Raven Guard's resolve remained unbroken. They embraced the danger, knowing that each operation brought them closer to avenging their fallen brothers and restoring honor to their shattered Legion. Beyond technological advancements, Corax also introduced new tactical doctrines that diverged sharply from the traditional strategies of other Space Marine legions. Infiltration, misinformation, and psychological manipulation became the cornerstones of his approach. He began to deploy Raven Guard operatives as saboteurs and spies, embedding them within traitor forces to sow discord and gather intelligence. Through careful misdirection, Corax's operatives could turn entire units against each other, creating chaos within the ranks of the enemy before the Raven Guard struck. This reliance on psychological warfare became one of Corax's most effective tools, as he understood that Horus's forces, while powerful, were vulnerable to mistrust and internal strife. In one notable campaign, Corax orchestrated a daring plan to dismantle a massive traitor stronghold that served as a staging ground for assaults across the region. Using a mix of infiltrators and misinformation, he fed false intelligence to the traitor forces, convincing them that an Imperial fleet was on its way to bombard the fortress. This fabricated threat caused a wave of panic, leading the traitor commanders to abandon key defensive positions as they prepared for an attack that would never come. As the stronghold weakened from within, Corax launched his assault, targeting the most vulnerable sections of their defenses. The Raven Guard's elite forces struck with surgical precision, seizing the fortress in a swift and decisive blow. The victory demoralized the local traitor forces, and word of the Raven Guard's cunning tactics spread, deepening the psychological fear they inspired among Horus's followers. Corax's innovations in warfare attracted the interest of some loyalist commanders who saw the potential in his unconventional methods. However, the Raven Guard's increasingly ruthless tactics also garnered criticism. High-ranking members of the Imperium feared that his tactics risked eroding the honor and discipline that defined the Space Marine legions. But Corax understood the stakes better than most. He knew that to fight against traitors who had forsaken all codes of honor, he would need to employ every resource, every strategy that could deliver results. He would not hesitate to use whatever tools or tactics necessary to ensure that the forces of darkness were met with equal ferocity. This willingness to push the boundaries of traditional warfare even led Corax to experiment with forbidden doctrines, including deep psyche conditioning for select Raven Guard squads. These warriors underwent intense psychological training, conditioning them to withstand the horrors of chaos and nullify the seduction of the warp. The conditioning came at a cost, however, rendering these soldiers emotionally detached and difficult to reintegrate with their brothers. Yet Corax saw this sacrifice as essential to the survival of his legion, a necessary adaptation in a war that demanded resilience beyond physical strength. Throughout this period, Corax found himself haunted by the toll his decisions took on his legion. He understood that each mission, each choice, carried a cost. His warriors were more effective than ever, yet many became hardened, distant, shadows of the warriors they once were. In his moments of solitude, Corax would reflect on the path he had led them down, wrestling with the knowledge that, for every success, a part of his legion's spirit was lost. The Raven Guard had once been defenders of the innocent, but they were now forced to embody something darker, avengers who embraced the shadows and the bitter resolve needed to face traitors. Despite these sacrifices, Corax pressed on. His tireless campaign against Horus's forces took the Raven Guard to some of the most treacherous sectors in the galaxy, where the forces of chaos held sway and the warp's influence tainted every corner. The darkness that Corax encountered in these cursed zones further fueled his hatred for the traitor legions and reinforced his commitment to eradicating them, even if it meant abandoning any hope of return to the ideals he had once cherished. Amid this unyielding campaign, Corax received intelligence that brought him to a critical choice, an opportunity to strike directly at one of Horus's senior commanders. Such a target, if eliminated, would deliver a heavy blow to the traitor cause, demoralizing Horus's followers and potentially shifting the balance of power. The operation would be treacherous, requiring the full use of every forbidden technology and tactic Corax had accumulated. Yet the potential rewards were too great to ignore, and Corax resolved to see it through. With meticulous planning, the Raven Guard infiltrated the enemy's heavily fortified base, employing every shadow, every unseen passage. At the center of the compound, Corax and his warriors found their target, a commander steeped in the power of chaos, one who embodied everything Corax despised. The battle that ensued was fierce, a brutal close-quarters confrontation in the pitch-black corridors of the fortress. Corax himself faced the commander, their blades clashing amidst the flickering lights and the whispers of the warp. The encounter tested every ounce of his resolve, as the taint of chaos threatened to consume everything it touched. Yet, even in the depths of this struggle, Corax's will remained unbroken. With a final, calculated strike, he defeated the chaos-tainted commander, dealing a severe blow to the forces of Horus. But as the dust settled, Corax realized the personal toll that such battles took upon him. Each victory left him a little darker, a little more distant from the ideals that had once driven him. His path had become a descent into the shadows, a journey that demanded endless sacrifice and an acceptance of moral compromise. With each hard-won victory, Corax and the Raven Guard became a legion transformed, an elite force tempered by loss, bound by loyalty, and forged in the darkness of war. They were no longer the same warriors who had fought for deliverance. They were something darker, more relentless. and for Corax there was no longer any turning back. The Raven Guard had become one with the shadows, and in those shadows they would remain, committed to their endless war against the night. Corax's unrelenting campaign against the traitor forces and the dark powers backing them had transformed him into a figure both feared and respected by his enemies. Yet, as his methods grew ever more extreme and the burdens of command weighed heavily on him, Corax found himself questioning the very foundations of his mission. The once clear line between honor and necessity had blurred, and he was forced to confront choices that tested his convictions in ways he had never anticipated. It was in these moments of inner turmoil that Corax would make decisions that would define his legacy, shaping him into a leader who, above all else, valued survival and resilience over traditional notions of valor or victory. One of the most harrowing moments of this journey began with the discovery of a new threat, a dark cult that had spread like a cancer within a sector under traitor control. The cult, known only as the Ashen Choir was infamous for its insidious influence, manipulating entire populations with whispered promises of power and liberation from the Imperium's chains. Unlike the overtly militant forces of chaos, the Ashen Choir operated through subtlety and corruption, using the allure of forbidden knowledge to ensnare minds and souls. It was an enemy that could not be confronted through conventional means, for its power lay in deception, secrecy, and the erosion of loyalty from within. Upon learning of the cult's activities, Corax understood the immediate danger it posed, not only to his forces, but to the broader war effort against the traitors. If left unchecked, the Ashen Choir could undermine the unity of entire worlds, turning loyalists against one another and spreading doubt throughout Imperial ranks. Recognizing that a direct assault would be both costly and ineffective against such a shadowy foe, Corax devised a more insidious plan: to infiltrate the cult itself and dismantle it from within. Corax selected a small cadre of Raven Guard operatives, warriors of unwavering loyalty and skill in subterfuge, and tasked them with embedding themselves within the Ashen Choir's ranks. It was a mission fraught with risk, for the cult's practices often involved dark rituals and exposure to the warp's influence. But these chosen warriors accepted the burden, steeling themselves against the horrors they would inevitably encounter. Disguised as outcasts and deserters, they infiltrated the cult's hidden gatherings, passing undetected among the Ashen Choir's followers, gathering intelligence and planting seeds of distrust wherever they could. As Corax's operatives delved deeper into the cult's ranks, they witnessed the true extent of the Ashen Choir's depravity. They observed twisted rituals that defiled both flesh and spirit, ceremonies that bound the souls of the weak to the powers of chaos. The operatives knew that their own minds and souls were at risk, for each ritual, each interaction with the cultists exposed them to the taint of the warp. But they endured, reporting back crucial information that allowed Corax to map out the cult's influence and identify its hidden leaders. With the intelligence gathered, Corax began a calculated purge. He dispatched Raven Guard squads to target the cult's leaders, striking from the shadows and eliminating them with ruthless precision. These were not grand battles, but silent assassinations, surgical strikes that left the cult reeling, its hierarchy shattered. Yet Corax did not stop there. To ensure that the cult would not simply regrow, he ordered his operatives to dismantle the Ashen Choir's propaganda networks, disrupting their communications and cutting off their channels of influence. In a matter of weeks, the cult was crippled, its followers scattered and leaderless, unable to rebuild. But the mission had not come without a price. The Raven Guard operatives who had infiltrated the cult returned changed, haunted by the darkness they had been forced to endure. Some bore physical scars, reminders of the rituals they had been compelled to partake in to maintain their cover. Others showed signs of psychological trauma, plagued by nightmares and visions that they could not shake. Corax understood the toll his command had taken on them and ensured that they were honored, but he also knew that the experience had left a stain upon their souls, an irreversible mark that reminded him of the sacrifices required in this unending war. Yet, for all the pain and sacrifice, Corax's victory over the Ashen Choir solidified his belief in the effectiveness of unconventional warfare. He saw that by striking from within, by using his enemy's own methods against them, he could achieve results that a traditional force could never replicate. This approach would come to define his strategy in the latter stages of the heresy, as he continued to wage war on Horus's forces with tactics that blurred the line between astartes and assassin. The Raven Guard had become a legion apart, shaped by Corax's singular vision and the necessities of a war that left no room for mercy or hesitation. As the heresy dragged on, the toll on Corax became increasingly apparent. His interactions with his fellow primarchs grew infrequent, limited to terse exchanges and strategic discussions rather than camaraderie or counsel. The Raven Lord had grown distant, choosing to keep his own counsel and relying solely on his legion, which he had molded into a force as unyielding and uncompromising as he had become. His once burning sense of justice had become tempered, hardened by the constant demands of warfare and the harsh truths he could no longer deny. Amid these dark days, Corax received intelligence of an unexpected opportunity, the chance to disrupt a major trader supply route that serviced several of Horus's key war fronts. Seizing this lifeline would deal a devastating blow to the traders' logistics, hindering their ability to maintain their war efforts and forcing them to divert critical resources. Corax wasted no time in assembling a strike force, utilizing every asset at his disposal, from stealth-equipped ships to infiltration teams equipped with the most advanced cloaking technology. The operation was meticulously planned. Corax's forces would infiltrate the supply lines at key points, disabling transport hubs and rerouting convoys to isolated locations where they could be intercepted and destroyed. Each strike would be executed with surgical precision, designed to minimize exposure while maximizing disruption. As his warriors moved into position, Corax himself led a vanguard force, intent on ensuring the mission's success. He had become the embodiment of his legion's ideals, swift, silent, and deadly, leaving nothing to chance. The campaign unfolded with chilling efficiency. The Raven Guard struck without warning, disabling entire convoys before the trader forces could react. Supplies intended for the trader legions were rerouted, sabotaged, or destroyed. Horus's forces scrambled to counter the attacks, but Corax's meticulous planning and the Raven Guard's flawless execution left the enemy reeling. For every convoy lost, the traders grew more desperate, and their morale began to falter under the strain of relentless attrition. Yet, amidst this victory, Corax recognized an unsettling truth. He had become a reflection of the very methods he had once condemned. The calculated ruthlessness of his tactics, the willingness to sacrifice and manipulate, had eroded the ideals he once held so fiercely. The line between justice and vengeance had faded, leaving him with a sense of emptiness that no victory could fill. Though his legion's actions struck terror into the hearts of the enemy, he could no longer escape the feeling that he was losing something essential, an intangible part of himself that he had once believed inviolable. In the quiet moments between battles, Corax would retreat into the shadows, contemplating the path he had chosen and the sacrifices that had come with it. He thought of deliverance, of the ideals that had once driven him, and of the warriors he had led into this darkness. Each loss weighed on him, each life a reminder of the legion he had vowed to rebuild and protect. But the universe left him no time for regrets. The heresy demanded action, and there was always another battle, another enemy to strike down. Corax and the Raven Guard became a symbol of survival against impossible odds, a beacon of resistance in a galaxy gripped by betrayal. His tactics, born of necessity and honed by sacrifice, set the Raven Guard apart from their fellow legions, casting them as both saviors and shadows. Corax understood that his path was a lonely one, but he was unyielding, driven by a duty that transcended even his own ideals. For the Raven Lord, there could be no surrender, no retreat, only the cold, unending resolve to carry on no matter the cost. In these shadow depths, Corax prepared himself for the battles to come, knowing that the heresy's end was far from certain and that his own fate was bound to the choices he had made. The Raven Guard had become creatures of the dark, and in that darkness they would continue their silent war, avenging the fallen and protecting the light, if only from afar. As the heresy neared its climax, Corax and the Raven Guard found themselves drawn ever deeper into a conflict that seemed boundless and unending, a tide of darkness that threatened to swallow the galaxy. Yet despite the relentless strain, Corax pushed forward with a fervor that bordered on obsession, his strategies growing ever more calculated and extreme. His enemies grew accustomed to seeing shadows flicker just before disaster struck, to hearing the faintest echo of wings as Raven Guard forces launched their silent, deadly strikes. However, the cost of this relentless pursuit weighed heavily on Corax, and in those rare moments of quiet, he wrestled with a creeping sense of alienation and doubt. The line between himself and the darkness he fought had become dangerously thin, and his isolation grew more profound with each passing campaign. The Raven Guard had, by necessity, adopted an almost monastic existence. Isolated from other loyalist legions, they operated without fanfare, with each warrior acutely aware of the growing distance between themselves and the ideals they once upheld. The close bonds that had defined them were now tempered by the grim determination of warriors who knew they might not return from the next mission. For Corax, the changes in his warriors were a reflection of his own internal struggle, a mirror showing him the faces of warriors who, like him, had become shadows of what they once were. His warriors had been shaped by war, but he could see in their eyes a weariness that came not from physical fatigue, but from the slow erosion of hope. It was during this period that Corax encountered a threat that would test him in ways no battle ever could: the persistent attempts by certain factions within the traitor legions to bring him under their sway. Through subtle messengers and intercepted communications, whispers reached him from within the warp-tainted ranks of his enemies, hinting at the freedom he could have if he abandoned the Imperium's cause. These offers promised power, autonomy, and an escape from the endless cycle of struggle. While Corax dismissed these overtures with disgust, the fact that his enemies believed he could be tempted troubled him deeply. It was as if the darkness around him recognized the fractures within his heart, probing them for weakness. These manipulations only steeled Corax's resolve, yet they left scars on his psyche. He saw these offers not as random gestures, but as targeted attacks meant to unravel his remaining convictions. He recognized that the traitors understood him too well. They knew he was isolated, weighed down by his burdens, and that he was fighting not only against them, but against the shadows within himself. The Raven Lord, who had once been a bastion of resilience, now found himself on a knife's edge, balancing his duty to the Imperium with the very real danger of losing himself to the bitterness and anger that had taken root in his heart. In response, Corax became even more vigilant. He devoted himself to purging any hint of corruption within his legion, implementing rigorous mental and spiritual fortifications for his warriors. He taught them to recognize the signs of taint, to confront their doubts before they could fester. This internal discipline became as critical to the Raven Guard's survival as their tactical acumen, for Corax knew that only through iron-willed self-control could they resist the temptations that lurked in the shadows of their minds. His warriors became more than soldiers. They were watchmen of their own souls, guardians not only of the Imperium, but of their own moral integrity. Amidst this inner battle, Corax led his forces into one of their most dangerous campaigns yet, the destruction of a vast corrupted stronghold deep within traitor-held territory. The fortress, known as Cavastor*, served as a hub for the traitor legions, a place where warp-wrought rituals were conducted and dark pacts were made. Its halls were steeped in corruption, its walls bearing the twisted symbols of chaos. To strike at Cavastor would be to challenge the very heart of the enemy's power, a statement that the Raven Guard would not cower in the face of darkness. Corax's plan was meticulously crafted. Rather than launching a full-scale assault, which would be both reckless and costly, he chose to dismantle Cavastor from within. Through a series of diversionary strikes, he drew out key defenders, weakening the stronghold's perimeter and sowing confusion among its ranks. Elite squads of Raven Guard infiltrated Cavastor's outer defenses, cutting communications and planting explosive charges at strategic points. The fortress's warp-spawned guardians, monstrous entities bound to the will of chaos sorcerers, were drawn into ambushes where Raven Guard warriors struck from the shadows, eliminating these abominations with chilling precision. Within days, Cavastor was in chaos, its defenders scattered and leaderless. Corax himself led the final assault, his presence striking fear into the traitor forces as he cut through their ranks. The Raven Guard fought with a grim, silent ferocity, their every movement a testament to the training and discipline instilled in them by their primarch. They made their way to the heart of the fortress, where a great altar to chaos stood, its surface slick with the blood of countless sacrifices. There, Corax confronted the leader of Cavastor's defenders, a twisted sorcerer who had once been an Imperial officer, now a warped instrument of the Dark Gods. The sorcerer taunted Corax, mocking his sense of loyalty and his refusal to embrace the power that chaos offered. But Corax, unmoved, unleashed his fury, striking the sorcerer down with a strength fueled not by hate, but by the iron resolve that had sustained him through the darkest of trials. As the fortress crumbled around him, Corax took a final grim satisfaction in the destruction of this den of corruption, knowing that he had dealt a significant blow to the enemy. However, even in victory, Corax was haunted by what he had seen. The remnants of Cavastor served as a stark reminder of what awaited should the forces of chaos go unchecked. He could feel the ever-present darkness encroaching, a weight that seemed to press down on him with each new battle. The destruction of Cavastor had been a triumph, but it had also shown him that the enemy was not just an external force. It was a pervasive, corrupting influence that sought to consume everything, including the warriors who fought against it. In the days following the assault, Corax withdrew into himself, seeking solace in solitude as he grappled with the enormity of the heresy's toll. His once unshakable faith in the Emperor's vision had been battered, his hope dimmed by the endless succession of sacrifices and the brutal choices he had been forced to make. The Raven Lord, who had once fought for ideals of freedom and justice, now faced the possibility that the Imperium he served might be beyond redemption. He began to wonder if, in his pursuit of vengeance, he had become what he had once despised. Yet, despite these doubts, Corax refused to abandon his duty. For all the darkness that surrounded him, he held fast to a singular, unyielding conviction. The Raven Guard would endure. No matter how much they sacrificed, no matter how far they fell, they would stand as the Imperium's silent defenders, willing to embrace the shadows if it meant safeguarding humanity from the horrors of chaos. He had led his legion into the depths of despair, but he would lead them out as well, forged anew by the trials they had endured. With this renewed determination, Corax turned his attention to the remaining stages of the heresy, preparing his legion for the final, grueling battles that lay ahead. Though his faith had been tested and his spirit scarred, he found strength in the resilience of his warriors. The Raven Guard had become a force of unbreakable resolve, bound not by idealism, but by the simple, fierce will to survive and protect. In these final days, as the heresy approached its cataclysmic conclusion, Corax embraced the shadows one last time, leading his warriors into the heart of darkness with a silent vow. They would endure whatever the cost until the very end. The galaxy may have been lost to chaos and ruin, but in the flickering shadows, the Raven Guard held firm, a glimmer of hope for the Imperium, even if it was a hope forged in darkness. As the climactic end of the Horus heresy approached, the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath. The Loyalists, battered and scattered, prepared for one final stand against the forces of darkness. For Corax and the Raven Guard, the path forward was wrought with both purpose and inevitability. Despite the constant attrition that had ravaged his legion, Corax remained undeterred, his mind sharpened and his spirit tempered by the fires of war. He had watched his legion dwindle, each loss tearing at him. Yet these sacrifices had only strengthened his resolve to confront Horus and his traitors one last time. In the quiet before the final battles, Corax took time to meet personally with his remaining officers and warriors, instilling in them his final lessons, preparing them not only for battle, but for survival in a galaxy that would likely remain turbulent long after the heresy. His message was clear, that whatever happened, the Raven Guard would continue their fight, adapting to whatever darkness the future held. They were no longer bound by a rigid code of honor, or even by hope. They were bound by an oath to protect humanity, a duty that would demand every measure of strength, cunning, and resilience they possessed. The Raven Guard moved silently into position, joining other loyalist forces as they amassed for a decisive strike. Corax knew the enormity of what lay ahead. The battles that awaited would demand everything from him and his warriors, as the traitor forces were now fortified by legions of chaos-touched astartes, demonic entities, and foul sorceries that defied understanding. Yet Corax, true to his character, had prepared for this. His forces moved with a purpose and confidence that belied their reduced numbers. They were shadows ready to engulf the flames of chaos, one final act of retribution for the devastation the traitors had wrought upon the galaxy. The battle was beyond anything Corax had faced, a chaotic convergence of power, hatred, and betrayal. The skies above became a hellscape of clashing ships and fire, while below, the ground trembled under the weight of clashing legions. The cries of demons mingled with the screams of fallen soldiers, and the very air was thick with the palpable presence of the warp, seething and roiling as if chaos itself was reaching out to claim the world. It was in this maelstrom that Corax led his warriors, each step a defiant act against the encroaching darkness, each strike a testament to the resilience of his legion. Despite the overwhelming odds, Corax fought with a ferocity that seemed fueled by all the losses he had suffered. As he cut through the corrupted ranks, he was relentless, his every movement calculated, each strike a precise blend of skill and savagery. The Raven Guard around him mirrored his resolve, moving with a silent fury as they dismantled traitor forces. They were a whirlwind of death, striking down chaos-spawned horrors with grim determination. Each engagement pushed them further to their limits, but they endured, held together by Corax's unwavering presence, a symbol of defiance that would not falter no matter the odds. In the midst of the chaos, Corax found himself facing a twisted mockery of one of his fallen brothers, a primarch tainted beyond recognition by the gifts of the dark gods. The encounter was brutal, a battle that was as much a test of will as it was of physical prowess. The two figures clashed, each representing polar opposites of what it meant to be a primarch. Corax, driven by duty, honor, and loyalty, and his foe, consumed by corruption and fueled by malevolent forces. Their battle was a dance of shadows and blood, each strike shaking the ground as they clashed, a brutal testament to the dichotomy of loyalty and betrayal. As the battle raged on, Corax felt the weight of his long and arduous journey, the years of hardship and sacrifice crashing down upon him in that single moment. Yet his spirit did not waver. With a final decisive blow, Corax felled his enemy, the traitorous primarch crumbling under the weight of his own corruption. Victory, however, was bittersweet, as the toll of the encounter left Corax weakened, his body battered and his spirit wearied. Still, he pressed forward, leading his warriors through the inferno of war, refusing to yield even as the forces of chaos closed in around them. In those final hours, Corax became more than a commander. He became a beacon of resistance, a figure of hope for those who fought alongside him. His presence rallied the remaining loyalist forces, his example serving as a reminder of what they fought for. With every step, Corax embodied the spirit of deliverance, the undying flame of justice and liberation that had fueled him since his earliest days. He was no longer merely a primarch. He was a symbol, a living embodiment of humanity's will to resist, even when all seemed lost. But as the battle reached its zenith, Corax sensed that his time among his legion was coming to an end. The galaxy they had known was irrevocably changed, and the forces of chaos would continue to lurk in the shadows, waiting for any opportunity to strike. He knew that his place was no longer among the legion he had shaped, that his path now led elsewhere, a solitary journey into the unknown, a final act of defiance against the darkness that had sought to consume him. After the dust settled and the last of the traitors had been driven back, Corax gathered his remaining warriors, offering them words of parting. He thanked them for their loyalty, for their sacrifices, and for standing with him against unimaginable odds. With a heavy heart, he announced that he would be leaving, entrusting the Raven Guard to continue their mission, to protect the Imperium and carry forward the legacy they had built together. He left them with a final command: to remain vigilant, to never succumb to the darkness that had claimed so many of their kin, and to always remember the ideals they had fought for, even in the face of despair. Corax's departure was a solemn moment for the Raven Guard, a quiet farewell that left a profound mark on those who remained. They watched as their primarch disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only the memory of his leadership and the teachings he had imparted to them. His absence would be felt deeply, yet his legacy endured. The Raven Guard, now more than ever, became the guardians of the Imperium's unseen threats, waging a silent war from the shadows, honoring the legacy of the Raven Lord who had led them through the darkest days. In the centuries that followed, stories of Corax's deeds grew into legend, a symbol of resilience and sacrifice. Some said he continued his fight alone, hunting the remnants of chaos with unyielding resolve, while others believed he had transcended mortal concerns, seeking a higher understanding beyond the reach of the Imperium's endless wars. His fate became one of the great mysteries of the Imperium, an enigma that only deepened his legend. For the Raven Guard, however, Corax's legacy was a guiding light in the vast and uncaring galaxy. They carried on his teachings, embracing the shadows and honing their skills to perfection, ready to strike when the Imperium needed them most. His absence was a wound that never fully healed, yet it strengthened their resolve, binding them together as a legion forged by sacrifice and tempered by loyalty. Corax's legacy endured in the hearts of his warriors, a testament to the Raven Lord's unbreakable spirit and his final act of defiance against the darkness.